They used to call me a failure, the dropout who would never make anything of herself. My father told me I'd always be a disappointment. My mother said I'd regret leaving. They laughed as I walked out of their house with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. 14 years later, the same people who mocked me are standing on my doorstep begging for my help to save everything they're about to lose. Before I tell you how it all unfolded, tell me this. If the family that abandoned you suddenly needed you to save them, would you do it or walk away? Comment your honest answer. I'm reading every one. The day I dropped out of college wasn't some dramatic movie moment. There were no slammed doors, no shouted ultimatums, no tears soaking my pillow as I packed a suitcase. It was quieter than that, heavier too. The kind of silence that seeps into your bones and stays there long after the words are gone. I was 19, a sophomore who hated every minute of the business degree my parents had insisted on. Numbers swam on the page, lectures felt like prison sentences, and each passing week I felt myself shrinking, becoming someone I didn't recognize. My dream had always been to work with my hands, to design and build furniture, but my father called it childish. "No one pays good money for wood and nails," he'd sneer. "Get a real career." The night I told them I was leaving, they sat across the kitchen table in silence. My father's jaw tightened with every word while my mother's face shifted between disbelief and disgust. The smell of burnt coffee hung in the air, bitter like the conversation itself. "So that's it?" my father finally said, leaning back in his chair. "You're quitting?" "I'm not quitting," I said quietly. "I'm choosing something that makes me happy." He laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Happy? You think happiness pays bills? Happiness doesn't build futures? It builds mine," I said, "and that's all I can build." It was my mother who spoke next, her voice trembling with anger. "We've sacrificed everything for you. We paid for the best schools, the best tutors, and you're throwing it all away for woodworking." "It's not just woodworking," I murmured. "It's design, craftsmanship, it's pathetic," my father cut in. "And so are you." Those words, "so are you," stayed with me. They burned more than any insult ever could, because deep down, I had spent 19 years trying to be enough for him, enough to make him proud, enough to make her smile, enough to be wanted. I wasn't enough. The next morning, I packed what I could into an old duffel bag. My father didn't come downstairs. My mother stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her silence more painful than any goodbye. I'd hoped even then that she might hug me, or tell me to be careful, or just say she loved me. But she didn't. "Don't come crawling back when you fail," she said instead, "because you will fail." I swallowed hard. Maybe, but at least it'll be my failure. And then I walked out of the house I'd grown up in, out of their expectations, out of the version of me they wanted. I didn't have a plan, no savings, no safety net, just a job offer from a local carpenter's workshop and a stubborn belief that I could turn this passion into a life. The first few years were brutal. I slept on a friend's couch for nearly a year. I took odd jobs, sanding, painting, repairing old furniture, just to scrape by. Some nights I ate instant noodles 3 times a day, other nights I went without dinner entirely. But for the first time in my life, I felt alive. I was creating. I was learning. I was building something that was mine. Meanwhile, I heard through distant relatives and old neighbors how my parents spoke about me. "She's a disappointment. She'll be back begging within a year. What a shame she turned out that way." They had written me off, erased me even. My older brother, the success story, was the one they paraded around at family gatherings. I was the cautionary tale. And yet, every time I picked up a piece of wood, every time I ran my hands over something I'd built from nothing, I felt stronger, more certain, more me. I thought I'd left their words behind. I thought I'd buried their judgment. But what I didn't know then, what I couldn't know, was that the day would come when those same people who told me I was worthless would be the ones knocking on my door. And when that day came, I wouldn't be the same girl they threw away. If leaving home was the hardest decision of my life, what came after was the hardest living I'd ever done. The first workshop I worked in was nothing like the sunlit studios you see in glossy design magazines. It was a cramped garage that smelled of sawdust, sweat, and machine oil. The air was always too hot in summer, too cold in winter, and always thick with the sound of tools chewing through wood. My first workbench was an overturned crate wedged between a pile of discarded timber and an ancient table saw that growled like a wounded animal, but to me it was heaven. I showed up every morning before sunrise, sweeping the floor, hauling lumber, sanding until my arms ached. I earned almost nothing, barely enough to cover bus fare and cheap groceries, but I soaked up every lesson like a dry sponge. My boss, an old carpenter named Luis, was a gruff man with grease-stained hands and a voice like gravel. He never praised, never smiled, never offered advice twice. But he taught me how to listen to wood, how to see the shape hiding inside the grain, how to make something from nothing. Most people think carpentry is about strength, he told me once, without looking up from a joint he was chiseling. But it's not, it's about patience. Wood rewards those who wait. I clung to those words because patience was all I had. The months bled into years, my hands grew calloused and my confidence stronger. I saved every spare coin I could, skipped meals, skipped outings, skipped everything that wasn't essential. Eventually, I could afford a second-hand set of chisels, then a small toolkit, then a corner of the workshop Luis let me rent for a few hours each night. That little corner became my sanctuary. When the other workers went home, I stayed behind, sketching designs on scrap paper, building prototypes from offcuts, experimenting with finishes and forms. It was clumsy work at first, crooked lines, uneven edges, pieces that wobbled when they should have stood firm. But every failure taught me something new. And slowly, the mistakes started to look like masterpieces. My first real commission came from a local cafe owner who needed new tables and couldn't afford big factory prices. I charged just enough to cover materials and a little extra for my time. When the pieces were delivered, she cried, not because they were perfect but because they were hers. Warm, handcrafted, one of a kind. That moment, her tears, her gratitude lit something inside me. Maybe I wasn't worthless, maybe I wasn't a failure. Maybe my family had been wrong. Word spread. One cafe job became two. Two became five. A boutique wanted custom shelves. A couple commissioned a dining table. Within 3 years I had enough clients to leave Luis's workshop and open a small studio of my own, a drafty old storage unit with cracked windows and peeling paint. I painted the walls myself, built my own work tables, hung my name above the door, by hand and heart, custom woodworks. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Even so, success didn't come easy. There were months when orders dried up and I wondered if my parents had been right all along. There were nights I cried on the cold workshop floor, exhausted, hungry, doubting everything. And every holiday season, when the rest of the world seemed wrapped in family warmth, I felt the sharp sting of absence. I still checked my phone sometimes, half hoping for a message from my mother. "Happy birthday. We miss you. Come home." It never came. What did come were whispers, little shards of gossip carried by mutual acquaintances. My brother was thriving, of course. He'd graduated top of his class, joined a corporate firm, and was already climbing the ladder. My parents glowed with pride when they spoke of him. When my name came up, they changed the subject. "She's doing her little hobby," they'd say dismissively. "Haven't heard from her in years, such a shame." I told myself their opinions didn't matter. And most days they didn't. But some nights when I stared at the ceiling too tired to sleep, they did. Because no matter how far you run, part of you always wants to be seen, especially by the people who refuse to see you at all. And then everything changed. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon, the kind where thunder sits low and angry in the sky, when a man in an expensive suit walked into my studio. He didn't belong there, too polished, too sharp, the kind of person my clients never were. "Are you her?" he asked, glancing at the sign above the door. "Depends who's asking," I said, brushing sawdust from my apron. He hesitated. "Your mother sent me." For a heartbeat, the world stopped. My breath caught, my pulse stumbled. I hadn't heard those words, "your mother," spoken aloud in nearly 7 years. "What?" I whispered. "She asked me to find you," he said, clearing his throat. "Your family needs you." The room suddenly felt smaller, quieter, like all the air had been sucked out of it. My mind raced with questions, but only one made it past my lips. "Why?" he exhaled slowly, meeting my eyes with something that looked almost like pity. "Because without you," he said, "they might lose everything. They used to call me a failure, the dropout who would never make anything of herself. My father told me I'd always be a disappointment. My mother said I'd regret leaving. They laughed as I walked out of their house with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. 14 years later, the same people who mocked me are standing on my doorstep begging for my help to save everything they're about to lose. Before I tell you how it all unfolded, tell me this: If the family that abandoned you suddenly needed you to save them, would you do it or walk away? Comment your honest answer. I'm reading every one. The day I dropped out of college wasn't some dramatic movie moment. There were no slammed doors, no shouted ultimatums, no tears soaking my pillow as I packed a suitcase. It was quieter than that, heavier too. The kind of silence that seeps into your bones and stays there long after the words are gone. I was 19, a sophomore who hated every minute of the business degree my parents had insisted on. Numbers swam on the page, lectures felt like prison sentences, and each passing week I felt myself shrinking, becoming someone I didn't recognize. My dream had always been to work with my hands, to design and build furniture, but my father called it childish. "No one pays good money for wood and nails," he'd sneer. "Get a real career." The night I told them I was leaving, they sat across the kitchen table in silence. My father's jaw tightened with every word while my mother's face shifted between disbelief and disgust. The smell of burnt coffee hung in the air, bitter like the conversation itself. "So that's it?" my father finally said, leaning back in his chair. "You're quitting?" "I'm not quitting," I said quietly. "I'm choosing something that makes me happy." He laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Happy? You think happiness pays bills? Happiness doesn't build futures?" "It builds mine," I said, "and that's all I can build." It was my mother who spoke next, her voice trembling with anger. "We've sacrificed everything for you. We paid for the best schools, the best tutors, and you're throwing it all away for woodworking." "It's not just woodworking," I murmured. "It's design, craftsmanship, it's pathetic," my father cut in. "And so are you." Those words, "so are you," stayed with me. They burned more than any insult ever could, because deep down, I had spent 19 years trying to be enough for him, enough to make him proud, enough to make her smile, enough to be wanted. I wasn't enough. The next morning, I packed what I could into an old duffel bag. My father didn't come downstairs. My mother stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her silence more painful than any goodbye. I'd hoped even then that she might hug me, or tell me to be careful, or just say she loved me. But she didn't. "Don't come crawling back when you fail," she said instead, "because you will fail." I swallowed hard. Maybe, but at least it'll be my failure. And then I walked out of the house I'd grown up in, out of their expectations, out of the version of me they wanted. I didn't have a plan, no savings, no safety net, just a job offer from a local carpenter's workshop and a stubborn belief that I could turn this passion into a life. The first few years were brutal. I slept on a friend's couch for nearly a year. I took odd jobs, sanding, painting, repairing old furniture, just to scrape by. Some nights I ate instant noodles 3 times a day, other nights I went without dinner entirely. But for the first time in my life, I felt alive. I was creating. I was learning. I was building something that was mine. Meanwhile, I heard through distant relatives and old neighbors how my parents spoke about me. "She's a disappointment. She'll be back begging within a year. What a shame she turned out that way." They had written me off, erased me even. My older brother, the success story, was the one they paraded around at family gatherings. I was the cautionary tale. And yet, every time I picked up a piece of wood, every time I ran my hands over something I'd built from nothing, I felt stronger, more certain, more me. I thought I'd left their words behind. I thought I'd buried their judgment. But what I didn't know then, what I couldn't know, was that the day would come when those same people who told me I was worthless would be the ones knocking on my door. And when that day came, I wouldn't be the same girl they threw away. If leaving home was the hardest decision of my life, what came after was the hardest living I'd ever done. The first workshop I worked in was nothing like the sunlit studios you see in glossy design magazines. It was a cramped garage that smelled of sawdust, sweat, and machine oil. The air was always too hot in summer, too cold in winter, and always thick with the sound of tools chewing through wood. My first workbench was an overturned crate wedged between a pile of discarded timber and an ancient table saw that growled like a wounded animal, but to me it was heaven. I showed up every morning before sunrise, sweeping the floor, hauling lumber, sanding until my arms ached. I earned almost nothing, barely enough to cover bus fare and cheap groceries, but I soaked up every lesson like a dry sponge. My boss, an old carpenter named Luis, was a gruff man with grease-stained hands and a voice like gravel. He never praised, never smiled, never offered advice twice. But he taught me how to listen to wood, how to see the shape hiding inside the grain, how to make something from nothing. Most people think carpentry is about strength, he told me once, without looking up from a joint he was chiseling. But it's not, it's about patience. Wood rewards those who wait. I clung to those words because patience was all I had. The months bled into years, my hands grew calloused and my confidence stronger. I saved every spare coin I could, skipped meals, skipped outings, skipped everything that wasn't essential. Eventually, I could afford a second-hand set of chisels, then a small toolkit, then a corner of the workshop Luis let me rent for a few hours each night. That little corner became my sanctuary. When the other workers went home, I stayed behind, sketching designs on scrap paper, building prototypes from offcuts, experimenting with finishes and forms. It was clumsy work at first, crooked lines, uneven edges, pieces that wobbled when they should have stood firm. But every failure taught me something new. And slowly, the mistakes started to look like masterpieces. My first real commission came from a local cafe owner who needed new tables and couldn't afford big factory prices. I charged just enough to cover materials and a little extra for my time. When the pieces were delivered, she cried, not because they were perfect but because they were hers. Warm, handcrafted, one of a kind. That moment, her tears, her gratitude lit something inside me. Maybe I wasn't worthless, maybe I wasn't a failure. Maybe my family had been wrong. Word spread. One cafe job became two. Two became five. A boutique wanted custom shelves. A couple commissioned a dining table. Within 3 years I had enough clients to leave Luis's workshop and open a small studio of my own, a drafty old storage unit with cracked windows and peeling paint. I painted the walls myself, built my own work tables, hung my name above the door, by hand and heart, custom woodworks. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Even so, success didn't come easy. There were months when orders dried up and I wondered if my parents had been right all along. There were nights I cried on the cold workshop floor, exhausted, hungry, doubting everything. And every holiday season, when the rest of the world seemed wrapped in family warmth, I felt the sharp sting of absence. I still checked my phone sometimes, half hoping for a message from my mother. "Happy birthday. We miss you. Come home." It never came. What did come were whispers, little shards of gossip carried by mutual acquaintances. My brother was thriving, of course. He'd graduated top of his class, joined a corporate firm, and was already climbing the ladder. My parents glowed with pride when they spoke of him. When my name came up, they changed the subject. "She's doing her little hobby," they'd say dismissively. "Haven't heard from her in years, such a shame." I told myself their opinions didn't matter. And most days they didn't. But some nights when I stared at the ceiling too tired to sleep, they did. Because no matter how far you run, part of you always wants to be seen, especially by the people who refuse to see you at all. And then everything changed. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon, the kind where thunder sits low and angry in the sky, when a man in an expensive suit walked into my studio. He didn't belong there, too polished, too sharp, the kind of person my clients never were. "Are you her?" he asked, glancing at the sign above the door. "Depends who's asking," I said, brushing sawdust from my apron. He hesitated. "Your mother sent me." For a heartbeat, the world stopped. My breath caught, my pulse stumbled. I hadn't heard those words, "your mother," spoken aloud in nearly 7 years. "What?" I whispered. "She asked me to find you," he said, clearing his throat. "Your family needs you." The room suddenly felt smaller, quieter, like all the air had been sucked out of it. My mind raced with questions, but only one made it past my lips. "Why?" he exhaled slowly, meeting my eyes with something that looked almost like pity. "Because without you," he said, "they might lose everything." For a few seconds I just stood there frozen in the middle of my own workshop with the words, "Your family needs you," ringing in my ears like a cruel joke. It had been almost 7 years since I'd last heard from them. 7 years since the day they'd called me a disgrace and slammed the door behind me. 7 years of silence so complete I'd convinced myself I didn't care anymore. And now, out of nowhere, they needed me. I set the chisel down slowly, as if any sudden movement might break the strange, fragile moment. "I think you're mistaken," I finally said, my voice steady but sharp. They made it pretty clear I was useless to them. The man, mid-40s, expensive watch, the faintest smell of cologne that screamed corporate, shifted awkwardly. "I understand how this must feel," he said carefully, "but things have changed." Changed? I laughed, a sound more bitter than amused. Did the definition of worthless suddenly shift in the dictionary? He sighed, pulling a sleek leather folder from his briefcase and laying it gently on my workbench. I'm here on behalf of your parents. They asked me to explain the situation before they reach out themselves. Your father's business, the family company, is in serious trouble. It's been mismanaged for years. Your brother tried to step in, but let's just say he wasn't as prepared as they thought. I blinked. And what does that have to do with me? Quite a lot, actually. He flipped the folder open, revealing spreadsheets, property documents, and court notices. The company is facing foreclosure, your parents' house is on the line, and from what I understand, you are the only one in the family with enough capital to help. I stared at the papers, my heart pounding in my chest. My business, the one they mocked, dismissed, ignored, had grown more than even I realized. My custom designs were now shipped across the country. I'd invested wisely, built partnerships, and recently acquired a small property portfolio, and apparently they knew all of it. They've been watching me, I said softly, piecing it together. He hesitated. They've kept an eye on your progress. Yes, your father was too proud to reach out, but your mother insisted. She wanted to ask for your help directly. The words twisted something inside me. My mother, the same woman who hadn't called for birthdays, graduations, heartbreaks, the same woman who'd once told me, "You're embarrassing this family." Now she wanted to speak to me. Why now? I asked, my voice low. Why not when I was sleeping in a freezing studio? Why not when I had nothing and needed a mother? The man had no answer for that, he only straightened his tie and cleared his throat. They're desperate, that's the truth. Silence hung between us, heavy and suffocating. The rain outside hammered harder against the windows as if echoing the storm inside my chest. I thought of all the times I had cried myself to sleep, wishing my family cared. Of the countless moments I'd been told I would never make it. Of the holidays spent alone, scrolling past pictures of them laughing without me. And now they wanted my help. Tell them I'll think about it, I said finally. He nodded, relief flickering across his face. I'll let them know. When he left, I stood there for a long time staring at the rain through the glass. My studio, my sanctuary felt different now. It wasn't just a workshop anymore, it was proof. Proof that I wasn't the failure they'd branded me. Proof that I had built something powerful with nothing but stubbornness and grit. Proof that I had won. But with that victory came a question I'd never expected to face. Could I forgive the people who had broken me when they were now the ones begging me to save them? That night I barely slept. My mind replayed every memory, every wound, every harsh word, and beneath the anger and the hurt, something else stirred, something I didn't want to admit. Part of me wanted to see them again, part of me wanted them to look me in the eye and realize how wrong they'd been, and part of me, the part I'd buried under layers of resentment, still craved their approval. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I wasn't ready to forgive. I wasn't even sure I ever would. But I was ready to face them, not as the failed daughter they'd cast out, but as the woman they could no longer ignore. I grabbed my coat, locked the studio, and called the number the man had left me. Tell them, I said, I'll come by this weekend. There was a pause. I'll pass along the message. As I hung up, I caught my reflection in the workshop window, older, stronger, eyes steadier than the girl who'd been thrown out years ago. This time, I wasn't going back as a broken daughter, I was going back as the one person who could decide their fate. The drive back to my childhood town felt like traveling through time, except this time I was the one in control of the clock. The streets were the same, the tiny corner store still had that peeling yellow paint, and the park where I used to sit and cry after fights with my family was still there, its rusty swings creaking in the wind. But everything looked smaller now. Or maybe I'd just grown. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as the old family house came into view. It sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, its once pristine white paint now dulled and cracked. The yard was overgrown. The shutters hung crookedly. It was a far cry from the proud, perfect home they had always boasted about, and yet standing in front of it, my heart still thudded like a scared teenager's. I parked and just sat there for a moment, watching the front door. My chest felt heavy, like there was a brick pressing against my ribs. I wasn't sure if I was ready for this. I wasn't sure if I would ever be ready for this, but I hadn't come this far to turn back. I got out, took a deep breath, and walked up the driveway, the same one I dragged my suitcase down the night they told me to leave. The same one my father had stood on, arms crossed, as my mother said, "You're a disappointment, don't come back until you have something to show for yourself." Now here I was, and I had everything to show. I rang the bell, it chimed faintly, followed by muffled footsteps. Then the door creaked open, and there she was, my mother. Time had carved lines into her face, deeper than I remembered. Her once perfect hair was streaked with silver, her sharp eyes dimmer but still assessing me the way she always had, as if looking for flaws. For a moment neither of us spoke, we just stared. "Hi," I said finally. My voice was steady but my hands were trembling. Her lips parted but no words came out, and then suddenly tears welled in her eyes. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're here." She reached out as if to touch me, but I instinctively stepped back. It wasn't intentional, it was muscle memory. All those years of rejection had wired me to flinch at her closeness. "Can I come in?" I asked. She nodded quickly, wiping at her tears. Of course, sweetheart, please." The word sweetheart hit me harder than I expected. It had been so long since she'd called me that. It felt foreign, almost mocking. I stepped inside and was immediately hit by a wave of nostalgia and something else. The house smelled different, like antiseptic and dust. The walls were bare where framed photos used to hang. The air itself felt tired, worn down by time and regret. "Your father's in the study," she said quietly, leading me down the hallway. "He's not well." I hesitated, I wasn't sure I wanted to see him. My father had always been the harshest, the one who called me lazy, the one who said I was a burden. But I followed her anyway, my heart hammering in my chest. When we reached the study door, she paused. "He might not say the right things," she warned, her voice trembling, "but he's glad you're here." I pushed the door open. My father sat hunched behind his old oak desk, a pile of documents spread before him. He looked smaller too, not physically but in presence. The man who once seemed 10 feet tall now looked defeated. He glanced up when he heard the door and froze when he saw me. For a long time he didn't say anything. Then with a voice that was barely a whisper he said, "You came." I nodded. "I did." He looked down, ashamed. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I admitted, "but here I am." Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Finally he sighed, a long weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of every mistake he'd ever made. "We made mistakes," he said, still not meeting my eyes. "I made mistakes, I was hard on you, harder than I should have been." I swallowed hard. This wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was more than I'd ever gotten before. "I built a life without you," I said quietly. "It wasn't easy, but I did it, and now you want my help." He winced but didn't deny it. "Yes, we need you. The business is failing, the house, we're losing it." There it was, the truth laid bare. I took a slow breath. "And if I help you, then what? You go back to ignoring me? Pretending I don't exist?" "No," my mother said quickly from behind me. Her voice shook as she stepped into the room. "No. That's not what this is. We want to make things right, we want you back in our lives." The words stung. Now they wanted me back, now that I had money, now that I was useful. I looked between them, two people who had broken me into pieces, now sitting in the ruins of their own choices. "Let me think about it," I said, turning toward the door. "Please," my father said, his voice suddenly desperate. "Don't walk away." I paused in the doorway, my back still to them. "Funny," I said softly, "that's exactly what you did." Then I walked out, not in anger, not in triumph, but with the calm, deliberate steps of someone who finally had the power to choose. I drove back to my hotel in silence that night. The kind of silence that isn't empty but heavy, the kind that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The city lights blurred through the windshield, but all I could see were my parents' faces, older, smaller, broken. And for the first time in years, I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. Was it satisfaction, anger, pity? The truth was, it was all three, tangled together into a mess I couldn't untangle. I tossed my keys on the desk and collapsed onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling. My father's words replayed in my head on a loop, "We need you." The same man who once told me I was worthless was now saying he couldn't fix this without me. It should have felt like victory, poetic justice, but instead it felt like a test I wasn't sure I wanted to pass. I thought about everything I had built on my own, the business I started from scratch after years of struggle. The nights I spent working 2 jobs just to afford rent, the mornings I woke up wondering if I'd made a mistake dropping out. the loneliness that clung to me when I had no one to turn to. All of it, every single step I had done without them. And now here they were asking me to save the very life they'd shut me out of. I barely slept that night. By morning my decision still wasn't clear, but my heart told me I needed answers before I could make one. So against every instinct in my body I found myself driving back to the house the next day. This time my father was waiting on the porch before I even parked. He looked nervous, a look I'd never seen on his face before. The man who once barked orders like a general now fidgeted with his hands like a schoolboy waiting for a lecture. "Thank you for coming back," he said quietly as I walked up. "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I replied. We went inside. My mother was already at the table, a pot of coffee and 3 mugs laid out as if this were some kind of normal family gathering. It wasn't, nothing about this was normal. "We want to explain everything," she said softly. "No excuses, just the truth." I sat down, crossing my arms, then start talking. And they did. They told me about the family business, how years of poor decisions and bad investments had driven it into the ground, how Dad's health had started to fail, leaving them with medical bills they couldn't pay, how the mortgage was overdue, the bank threatening foreclosure, how they were weeks, maybe days away from losing everything. By the time they finished, the room was silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. "So let me get this straight," I said slowly. "You called me a failure, you threw me out. You never once tried to contact me, not for birthdays, not for graduations, not for anything. But now that you're broke and desperate, you suddenly remember you have a daughter." My father flinched. My mother's eyes welled with tears. "We were wrong," she whispered, "so terribly wrong." "Wrong doesn't even begin to cover it," I snapped, my voice shaking. "Do you have any idea what those years were like for me? Do you know how many nights I cried myself to sleep thinking I was worthless because you told me I was?" "Every day," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Every single day we regret it." There was sincerity in her voice, raw and real, and that almost made it harder, because deep down I knew they did regret it. But regret doesn't erase scars, and it certainly doesn't make trust magically reappear. "What are you asking me for?" I asked finally. "A loan," my father said quietly. "Or an investment. Something to help us save the house, save the company. We'll pay you back every cent." I laughed, not out of humor but disbelief. "You want me to invest in the family that invested nothing in me?" "We know how it sounds," he said quickly, "but this isn't just about us, it's about your grandfather's legacy, about the family name, about everything we built." "You built," I corrected him. "Not me. I was never part of that we, remember?" Silence. I stared down at my hands. The truth was, I could help them. I had more than enough money, one transfer from my account, and their problems would disappear. But at what cost? Would I be rescuing them or betraying myself? I didn't have an answer. Finally, I stood up. "I need time to think," I said. "This isn't something I'm going to decide over coffee." "Of course," my mother said quickly, rising too. "Take all the time you need." But as I walked out the door and down the familiar driveway, I realized time wasn't the issue. The issue was trust, and that, I wasn't sure they'd ever earn again. The drive back to the city felt longer than usual, maybe because my thoughts were heavier. Maybe because a part of me, the part that had been screaming for years to be seen, was suddenly louder than it had ever been. I pulled into the garage of the apartment I had bought with my own money. Every square inch of it had been earned through sleepless nights, humiliating setbacks, and tiny victories that no one had been there to witness. The polished marble floors, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline, they weren't just decor, they were proof. Proof that I was never a failure. Proof that I could build something beautiful from the ashes they left me in. I walked through the hallway, trailing my fingers along the framed photos on the wall. None of them were family pictures, just snapshots of my journey, my first office space, a team of 3 crammed into a shoebox room. My first product launch, the day I signed the deal that changed everything. Every memory here was mine alone, and yet it still felt incomplete. I sank into the couch, exhaling a long, shaky breath. For years I had told myself I didn't need them. And for the most part I had believed it. But their faces kept flashing in my mind, the desperation in my father's eyes, the guilt in my mother's trembling voice. It was like a wound I thought had scarred over had suddenly been ripped open again. I poured myself a glass of wine and stared out the window. Down below, the city pulsed with life, people chasing dreams, running from pasts, building futures, and there I was, caught somewhere in between. I thought back to the worst night of my life. It was raining hard the night they threw me out. I'd just failed another exam, and Dad's voice still echoed in my ears. "You're an embarrassment to this family." My clothes were soaked, my hands shaking as I clutched the single duffel bag they allowed me to take. I remember standing on the curb, watching the house lights go dark behind me. They hadn't even waited for me to leave before locking the door. That memory used to hurt less. But now, with them begging for my help, it burned again, raw, sharp, unforgettable. My phone buzzed on the table. A message from Maya, my oldest friend, the one who'd taken me in that night and let me crash on her couch for months while I figured my life out. "Heard they reached out. You, okay?" Maya's text read. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "I don't know," I replied. "They want me to bail them out." "Of course they do. And you? Do you want to?" she asked. "That's the problem. I don't know if helping them is healing or betrayal." Her reply came instantly. "Then maybe you're not ready to decide. And that's okay. Just remember, you don't owe them a damn thing." I put the phone down and closed my eyes. She was right. I didn't owe them anything, not forgiveness, not money, not even a second chance. But deep down I knew this wasn't just about them. It was about me. About who I wanted to be when this was over. Was I still that abandoned girl in the rain? Or had I truly become the woman who could rise above it all? The truth was, I wasn't sure. Not yet, but one thing was clear: if I was going to make a decision, it would be on my terms, and that meant facing the last part of my past I had spent years avoiding. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I'd been ignoring for over a decade. Liam. My brother. The golden child, the one who had stood by silently while they destroyed me. My thumb hovered over the call button, my heart pounded. Then I pressed it. It rang once, twice. "Hello?" His voice was cautious, unsure. "It's me," I said quietly. "We need to talk." The silence on the other end said everything, and I knew this was just the beginning. The line was silent for a long time. Just the sound of his breathing, cautious, almost guilty on the other end. It was strange how familiar it felt, that silence. We had spent so many years not talking, it was almost poetic that when we finally did, words refused to come. "Wow," he finally said, his voice shaky. "I honestly never thought I'd hear from you again." "Neither did I admitted. Another pause, then, "Are you okay?" It was such a simple question, but it hit deeper than I expected. I almost laughed. Was I okay? After being called worthless, thrown out, abandoned, and then suddenly being begged to save the very people who destroyed me. I didn't know what okay even meant anymore. "I'm not sure," I said, "but I need answers, and you're the only one who can give them to me." There was a long sigh on his end. "Then maybe we should talk in person, tomorrow," I said firmly. "Coffee. Noon, okay." The next day, I walked into a small cafe tucked on a quiet corner of downtown neutral territory. The smell of roasted beans and sugar hung in the air, but it did nothing to steady my racing heart. And then I saw him. Liam, perfect, polished, composed, just like he always was. He stood as soon as he saw me, that same practiced smile on his face, the golden child, the one who got the praise, the love, the trust, everything I had begged for. "You look incredible," he said, almost in awe. I sat down without responding. "Let's not do small talk, right?" He swallowed hard. "You want answers?" I nodded. "Start with this: why didn't you stop them?" His eyes flickered downward. "I tried. Not hard enough," I snapped. "You watched them destroy me, Liam. You watched them throw me out. You didn't call. You didn't write. You didn't even ask if I was alive. You were their favorite. You could have made them listen." He rubbed his temples like the weight of years was finally pressing on him. "You're right, I could have done more, but you need to understand, I wasn't as free as you think." I scoffed. "Free? You had everything: college, support, money. They practically worshipped the ground you walked on. And that was the problem," he said quietly. "I was their investment, their future, their reputation, and when you left, all that pressure fell on me. Dad made it clear, if I didn't succeed, I'd end up just like you. And I was terrified of that." It was the first time I'd ever heard him sound human. Not perfect, not polished, just scared. But I wasn't ready to let him off the hook. "So you chose safety over me." He winced. Yes, and it's the biggest regret of my life. Silence settled between us again, a heavy, suffocating silence. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time I noticed the cracks. The tired eyes, the slight tremor in his hands, the way he fidgeted with his wedding ring like it was a chain rather than a choice. Why now? I asked finally. Why reach out now? Because they're falling apart, he said. And so am I. He leaned forward, his voice breaking. I know you have every right to hate us, I know we don't deserve your help, but if you walk away now, everything, the business, the house, everything Grandpa built, it's gone. And no matter how angry you are, that legacy is yours too. I stared at him, my throat tight. Legacy. The word felt like a ghost. I had spent my entire adult life trying to build my own, and now they were trying to drag me back into theirs. I don't know if I care about their legacy, I whispered. Then care about yours, Liam said, his eyes locking with mine. You've proven you don't need us, but maybe now it's not about need. Maybe it's about closure. His words hung in the air like smoke. Closure. Was that what this was about? Saving them or saving the part of me that still ached for a family that never existed? I stood, my chair scraping the floor. I'm not promising anything, I said, but I'll think about it. He nodded, his eyes wet. That's more than I deserve. I walked out into the afternoon sun, the city buzzing around me, but I felt like I was standing still. Everything inside me was tangled, rage and pity, vengeance and compassion. I didn't know if I wanted to save them or watch them burn, but one thing was clear: the decision I made next wouldn't just define their future, it would define mine. That night I didn't sleep, not a single second. My mind was a battlefield, and every thought was a soldier refusing to surrender. Every insult, every slammed door, every birthday they forgot. Every time they told me I'd never amount to anything, they all came roaring back like a storm I thought I'd outrun, and now here they were standing at my doorstep, begging me to be their salvation. It wasn't just ironic, it was infuriating, but beneath the anger, something else stirred, something quieter, more dangerous. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't pity, it was power. For the first time in my life, I had all of it. They needed me, I didn't need them. And that realization was both intoxicating and terrifying. The next morning, I decided to do something I hadn't done in over a decade. I drove back to the old neighborhood. The streets hadn't changed much, same peeling fences, same nosy neighbors, same cracked sidewalks, but I wasn't the broken girl they discarded. I was someone entirely new, and for the first time I wanted them to see it. I parked in front of the house, their house, and just sat there for a minute watching it through the windshield. It looked smaller now, duller, like the power it once held over me had evaporated. When I finally rang the doorbell, my father answered, his face lit up with something like hope, desperate, fragile hope. You came. I said I'd think about it, I replied coolly. They ushered me inside. Papers were scattered across the dining table, bills, foreclosure notices, bank statements. The life they'd built was crumbling in front of them, and in the middle of that chaos they stood. Suddenly human, suddenly vulnerable. I've gone through everything, I said, gesturing to the mess. I know how much debt you're in. I know the company's worth less than the building it's in, and I know the bank could repossess this house in a matter of weeks. My father nodded, shame clouding his face. It's all true, and you're asking me to fix it. Yes, he whispered. I let the silence stretch. I wanted them to feel it, the weight of every decision, every word that led us here. I said finally. With one transaction I could save this house, I could clear the debts, I could even restructure the company and make it profitable again. My mother clasped her hands together. Oh, sweetheart. But, I interrupted sharply, I won't, not for free. Their faces shifted, confusion, then fear. What do you mean? My father asked. I took a deep breath. If I help you, things change completely. I'm not the failure anymore. I'm not the girl you disowned. If I step into this mess, I step in as owner. I take controlling shares of the company. I decide what happens with this house. I call the shots. Not you. They stared at me as if I'd spoken another language. You'd take over? My mother whispered. Yes, I said, or I walk away and let the bank do it for me. Your choice. My father's jaw tightened. That's extreme. No, I said coldly. Extreme was calling your daughter worthless and throwing her into the streets. This is business, and in business power goes to the one holding the money. That's me. The room was silent. I could see the war raging inside him, pride battling desperation. But desperation was winning. Finally, he nodded, slow and deliberate. If those are your terms, we accept. It was surreal. The same man who once spat the word failure at me like venom was now agreeing to hand me everything. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rewriting the story. I stood, pulling a folder from my bag and sliding it across the table. These are the preliminary documents. I've already had my lawyers draft them. Read them over. We'll finalize everything by next week. My mother's hands trembled as she reached for the papers. I don't know how to thank you. Don't, I said. Just don't ever forget who saved you. I turned to leave, pausing at the door. Oh, and one more thing, I added without looking back. From this moment on, I decide when or if we're a family again. The door clicked shut behind me, but the sound wasn't final. It wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a story I was finally writing on my own terms, and this time I wasn't the broken daughter begging to be loved. I was the woman they would never underestimate again. The morning after they signed the preliminary papers, something shifted inside me. It wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about reclaiming something that had been stolen from me long ago. My voice. For years I'd believed their version of who I was, the failure, the disappointment, the one who would never make anything of herself. And now, here I was, walking into the boardroom of the very company they once said I wasn't good enough to inherit, not as their disgraced daughter but as the new majority owner. The board members stared as I walked in. Some recognized me instantly, their faces twitching with thinly disguised surprise. Others exchanged confused glances, unsure why a stranger had been invited to this emergency meeting. "Good morning," I said, setting my briefcase on the polished oak table. My voice didn't shake, it was calm, confident, steady. "I'm here to introduce myself as the company's new controlling shareholder." A hush fell over the room. My father, seated at the head of the table, cleared his throat. I can speak for myself," I interrupted. "My name is Ava Morgan, and effective immediately I hold 62% of the company. That means from this point forward every major decision goes through me." The reaction was instantaneous: whispers, protests, even a few scoffs from the older board members who'd been there since my grandfather's time. One man, Mr. Sterling, a senior partner who had known my father since childhood, slammed his pen down. "This is outrageous," he barked. "She's not qualified, she doesn't understand this business." I smiled, not sweetly but with the kind of confidence that makes people uncomfortable. "You're right. I don't understand how to run a company into the ground. I don't understand how to gamble away decades of legacy on risky investments. I don't understand how to alienate clients or mistreat employees, but I do understand how to build something from nothing because I've done it before." Silence. "I started my company in a one-bedroom apartment with $200 and a laptop," I continued, "and today it's worth over $50 million. So if anyone here wants to question my qualifications, I suggest you check your own resumes first." The room fell quiet. Even my father, the man who once told me I'd never be worth anything, couldn't meet my eyes. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. I tore through the company's financial records, restructured departments, replaced outdated systems, and introduced new technology and partnerships. At first, resistance was everywhere. Old board members quit. Longtime employees grumbled. Even my father, who was still listed as an advisor, pushed back against nearly every change I proposed. But slowly, results began to show. Clients who had left years ago returned, revenue started climbing. And the company, the same one they once said I wasn't good enough to be part of, began thriving under my leadership. And yet, something still felt heavy. I'd expected victory to feel triumphant, a movie moment where everything suddenly felt worth it. But instead I felt hollow, empty, because as much as I'd changed the company, the wounds in my family remained wide open. One evening, as I was packing up my office after another 14-hour day, my father appeared at the door. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, not physically but emotionally. "Can we talk?" he asked. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "We're talking." He sat, his hands clasped tightly. "I know you don't believe me when I say this, but I'm proud of you." The words hit me harder than I expected. I had dreamt of hearing them my whole life, but now they felt like too little, too late. "I didn't do this for you," I said quietly. I know, he replied, but I hope maybe someday you can forgive us. Forgive, the word lingered in the air like a ghost. I don't know if I can, I admitted. Not because I hate you, but because every part of my life, every scar, every sleepless night, every ounce of strength I had to build came from what you did to me. And I don't know how to forgive someone for shaping me through pain. He nodded slowly, his eyes wet. I understand. We sat there in silence for a long time, and for the first time since I was 17, the power dynamic had shifted completely. He wasn't the unshakable patriarch anymore. He was just a man, flawed, regretful, and deeply human, and maybe that was enough for now. By the end of the quarter, the company had not only survived, it was thriving. My name was on the contracts, my decisions in the headlines, but the victory wasn't just about business, it was about something much bigger. I wasn't the failed daughter anymore. I wasn't the exile or the disappointment. I was the one who rebuilt everything from the ashes they left behind. It was strange how silence felt louder than any argument. That's what I noticed first, the stillness as I stood in front of the old estate gates for the first time in nearly a decade. They loomed just as they always had, tall, black, and imposing, the same way this family had loomed over me my whole life, except this time I wasn't walking through them as the outcast, I was walking through them as the only one who could save them. The family reunion had been my father's idea. After the company's miraculous turnaround, the Morgans were back in the spotlight. Reporters wanted interviews, investors wanted meetings, and suddenly every cousin, uncle, and estranged sibling who had once mocked me wanted to reconnect. They said it was to celebrate, but I knew better. This wasn't a party, this was a reckoning. The dining hall looked almost identical to how I remembered it, the same polished mahogany table, the same oil portraits staring down from the walls, the same suffocating tension clinging to the air. But the people inside were different, or maybe I was. They all stood when I entered. Aunts who hadn't spoken to me since the day I left, cousins who'd called me the embarrassment. Even my older brother Ethan, the golden child, the heir apparent, was here, leaning against the wall with that same smugness he'd worn since childhood. "Look who decided to show up," he said, raising his glass, "our very own savior." The sarcasm dripped like poison, but I didn't flinch. "Save the theatrics," I replied coolly, sliding into my seat at the head of the table. His seat. We have a lot to discuss. At first the conversation was painfully polite. Toasts were made, smiles forced. They asked about the company's growth, about new deals, about future plans, but I could feel it bubbling underneath, the resentment, the jealousy, the guilt, and sure enough, it didn't take long to boil over. "So," my Aunt Lillian finally said, swirling her wine, "I suppose we're all supposed to thank you? After you abandoned this family?" I met her eyes calmly. "I didn't abandon anyone, I was cast out." "Oh please," Ethan scoffed. "You chose to walk away, you dropped out, ran off to chase some ridiculous dream, and now you want credit for crawling back?" I felt a spark ignite in my chest, the same old rage that had been buried under years of silence. But this time, I didn't swallow it. I let it burn. "You're right," I said, my voice steady. "I did walk away. Because staying here meant dying a slow death. Every day in this house I was reminded I wasn't enough, not smart enough, not successful enough, not obedient enough. And when I tried to prove myself, you all laughed, you mocked me, you told me I'd never be anything." The room went still. "And yet," I continued, leaning forward, "here we are with your debts, your lawsuits, your mismanaged empire, and the only person who can fix it is the one you called a failure." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Don't act like you're better than us, Ava. You're only here because we built this company. You're standing on our foundation." I laughed, a cold, bitter laugh that didn't sound like me. "Your foundation? You mean the one you nearly collapsed? The one I had to rebuild brick by brick while you were too busy polishing your egos?" It was like striking a match in a room full of gasoline. Voices rose, accusations flew, old wounds long buried ripped open. "You were always jealous of Ethan," my mother hissed. "You were selfish," shouted one cousin. "You humiliated us," another chimed in. And then, just as suddenly, it all fell quiet again because my father stood. "Enough," he said, his voice low but commanding. "All of you." The room stilled. Even Ethan's defiance faltered. He turned to me, not as the cold, unreachable man I'd known all my life, but as someone stripped of all his armor. "Ava, they're right about one thing. We did fail you, all of us. The words hung in the air like smoke. You were a child, he continued, his voice cracking. And instead of nurturing your potential, we crushed it. Instead of supporting your dreams, we mocked them. We told you who you were supposed to be. And when you refused, we abandoned you. And for that, I am sorry. I swallowed hard. I wanted to stay angry, to hold on to that righteous fury I'd carried for so long, but there was something about seeing my father, the unshakable patriarch with tears in his eyes, that made it impossible. Sorry doesn't erase the scars, I said softly. It doesn't undo the nights I cried myself to sleep, or the years I spent trying to prove I was worth something, or the fact that the only reason I'm here now is because I had to save the people who left me behind. I know, he whispered, but maybe it can be a start. The room was silent, no one dared speak, and for the first time in years I felt something shift, not the explosive satisfaction of revenge but something quieter, something more dangerous, hope, because maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to rebuild this family. Not the way it was, but into something better, stronger, real. But I also knew this: forgiveness wasn't a gift I was ready to give yet. It was something they'd have to earn. So I stood, looked around the table at the faces that had once broken me, and said, "This family will never be what it was. That version of us is gone. But if any of you truly want to build something new, something honest, I'm willing to try. But understand this, it happens on my terms now. No more control, no more manipulation, no more lies." And with that, I walked out, not because I was running from them, but because for the first time they would have to come to me. The house was silent when I returned 2 weeks later. No celebrations this time, no champagne flutes or polite smiles, just the heavy quiet that settles over a place where too much has been said and not nearly enough. I had agreed to come back after my father's request. "There's something you need to know," he'd said over the phone. His voice had been low, almost trembling. "It's time you heard the truth." I wasn't sure why I said yes. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was closure. Maybe, and I hated admitting this, a small part of me still wanted answers. The same grand foyer I'd walked through 100 times before felt smaller now, the air colder. My father was waiting in the library, seated by the fire, a stack of old leather-bound files spread out on the table beside him. "Thank you for coming," he said as I stepped inside. "Let's just get to it," I replied. My patience with sentimentality was running on fumes. He nodded, took a slow breath, and picked up the top folder. "This is about why things happened the way they did, why we pushed you so hard, why I treated you the way I did." I folded my arms. "Because you enjoyed watching me break?" He flinched but didn't argue. Instead, he slid a faded envelope across the table. My name was scrawled on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. "What is this?" I asked. "Your mother wrote it, 17 years ago." I hesitated, then opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, yellowed, creased, and trembling slightly in my hands. "My dearest Ava, if you're reading this, it means you're old enough to hear the truth. And you deserve the truth, even if it changes everything you believe about us, about yourself, about our family. The day you were born, things changed, not because we didn't love you, we did, more than anything, but because you were never supposed to exist. You were the result of a decision I made in a moment of desperation, a decision that your father has struggled to forgive me for ever since. You see, Ava, your father is not your biological father." The room spun, the air left my lungs. I stared at the words, reading them over and over again as if the ink might rearrange itself into something else, something that made sense. What is this?" I whispered. "Some kind of sick joke?" "No," my father said quietly. "It's the truth." I felt the ground tilt beneath me. "So all those years, the rejection, the hatred, the way you looked at me, it's because I wasn't yours?" He looked broken. "I wanted to love you, God knows I did. But every time I looked at you I saw him, and I hated myself for it. I hated you for it. I hated your mother for it. And instead of dealing with that hatred, I buried it under impossible expectations. I told myself that if you became perfect, if you achieved everything, maybe then I could finally accept you." The room was too quiet, my heartbeat roared in my ears. "So that's it?" I snapped. "That's why you spent my entire life reminding me I was worthless? Because you couldn't deal with your wife's mistake?" Tears welled in his eyes. "It wasn't a mistake, she loved him, and she loved you. And despite everything, I loved you too, even if I was too much of a coward to show it." I walked to the window, my chest tight, my hands trembling. All those sleepless nights, all the cruel words, all the rejection. And it was never really about me. It was about a ghost I had nothing to do with. And suddenly every memory looked different, the cold silences, the impossible standards. The way he always introduced Ethan as my son, but stumbled over the words when he said it about me. It had never been about my failures, it had always been about my existence. Who is he? I asked finally, my voice was barely a whisper. My father hesitated. A man your mother met before we married. He was brilliant, ambitious, she loved him deeply, but circumstances tore them apart. He never knew about you. Does he know now? No, he swallowed. And I don't know if he's even alive. The fire crackled. Somewhere down the hall a clock chimed the hour. It felt like the entire world was shifting under my feet. I turned to him, this man who had shaped so much of my pain, and saw for the first time, not the monster I had built in my mind but a deeply flawed, terrified human being, and I didn't know whether to scream or collapse. You had no right, I whispered. No right to make me hate myself for something I didn't do. I know, he said, and I will regret it until the day I die. I left the library without another word. The halls felt smaller now, the walls tighter. I needed air, space, time to breathe. But even as I stepped outside into the cold evening, the truth followed me like a shadow. I had spent my entire life trying to prove myself to a man who was never really my father. I had built empires, toppled legacies, rewritten destinies, all to win love that was never unconditional in the first place. And now, for the first time, I wasn't sure who I was. A daughter, a stranger, a legacy, a lie? All I knew was this: the story I'd been told about myself was gone, and in its place was something raw, terrifying, and strangely liberating, because if my past wasn't what I thought it was, maybe my future didn't have to be either. The first snow of winter was falling softly outside my window when I realized I hadn't seen my parents in almost 3 months. Since the family meeting, the one where everything was dragged into the light and every buried truth came clawing out, I'd thrown myself into work, into building, into anything that would keep me from sitting still long enough to feel. The company was thriving. My new product line had launched ahead of schedule. Investors were calling, magazines were profiling me, and my story was spreading far beyond the walls of the boardroom. To the world, I was a symbol of resilience, the girl who'd been thrown away and built an empire, but inside, something still felt unfinished. It wasn't anger anymore. That had burned itself out long ago. And it wasn't revenge either. I'd had plenty of chances to hurt them if I wanted to. It was something deeper, something quieter. A question I couldn't shake: if I could rebuild a business from nothing, could I rebuild a family too? I didn't know the answer, but I knew I had to try. That's how I found myself standing outside their house again on a Sunday afternoon, a pie from the bakery down the street balanced awkwardly in my hands. It wasn't a holiday. It wasn't anyone's birthday. There was no occasion, no agenda. I just came. When my mother opened the door, the look on her face said everything. Shock, relief, disbelief, and something softer too, like she was afraid to breathe in case this was just a dream. "Ava," she whispered. "You came." I figured it was about time, I said, my voice steady but my heart racing. She stepped aside and I walked into the house that had once felt like a battlefield. It was smaller now, not physically but in presence. The tension that had once clung to every wall was thinner, weaker, as if time and regret had eroded it. Dad was in the kitchen, sorting through bills at the table. When he saw me, he froze, his mouth opening like he wasn't sure if words were allowed. "Hi, Dad," I said. "Hi," he replied quietly, "it's good to see you." We sat together at the table. It wasn't a tearful reunion, there were no dramatic apologies or over-the-top gestures, just small talk at first, the weather, the new neighbors, the way the maple tree in the yard was starting to lean. But beneath every sentence there was something else, a cautious hope, a shared understanding that this was fragile and real and worth protecting. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. "I know it's too late to undo what we did," he said, "but if there's ever a way to earn back even a fraction of your trust, I'll spend the rest of my life trying." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I reached across the table and set my hand over his. "This," I said quietly, "is a start." The weeks that followed weren't perfect. We stumbled, we argued. Sometimes I left their house mid-conversation too overwhelmed to stay. Sometimes they said the wrong thing and didn't realize it until later, but slowly, painfully, we learned how to exist around each other again, not as the family we used to be, but as the one we were trying to become. They stopped pretending the past hadn't happened. I stopped pretending it didn't still hurt. And somewhere in that messy middle ground, we started to heal. One afternoon, months later, my mom invited me over for dinner. When I walked in, the table was set for three, and for the first time in almost 2 decades, it felt normal. We laughed, we shared stories, we disagreed about politics and argued over the best way to cook pasta. It wasn't magical, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. As I was leaving that night, my father walked me to the door. "I don't deserve your kindness," he said quietly. "Maybe not," I said, "but this isn't about deserving, it's about deciding." He nodded slowly, tears in his eyes. "Then thank you for deciding to try." I smiled. "We're all trying, Dad." Driving home that night, the city lights glowed softly against the windshield, and for the first time I felt something close to peace. The scars of my childhood would never fully disappear. They were part of me, woven into every decision, every success, every quiet moment, but so was forgiveness. It didn't mean forgetting, it didn't mean excusing, it meant choosing, every single day, to let love grow where bitterness once lived. And as the snow continued to fall around me, I realized something beautiful. I wasn't the failed daughter anymore. I wasn't the exile or the disappointment or the ghost of their mistakes. I was simply Ava, whole, strong, and finally home. They never asked me for money again. The company continued to flourish under my leadership, and I helped restructure their finances so they could rebuild too, but on my terms and with boundaries firmly in place. And though our family was never quite the same as it might have been, it became something far more honest, a fragile, healing love born from pain, choice, and the courage to begin again.